Dr. Bernard Golden, or should I say Bernie Golden?
Bernie's fine.
Bernie, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio. Bernie's a big name right now.
Really.
Yeah. So I'm very pleased to have you on the show. And the topic of our discussion, overcoming destructive anger, is certainly really timely. And I had not planned to start off this way, but of course, this mass shooting at the Pulse Club in Orlando, Florida, is on everybody's mind here, having happened just a day or two ago. Uh, has anybody contacted you to comment on this yet?
No, no, not at this time.
Well, let me be the first then, since destructive anger is kind of your thing. It would seem to me to be relevant to that event. So, what would you like to say vis-a-vis destructive anger and what was clearly an acting out of destructive anger?
Well, I think it does really reflect major elements of destructive anger in that anger is about feeling threatened and having some inner pain. And while we can't surmise, guess what kind of pain the shooter was experiencing, clearly there was anger, outrage that he couldn't control.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of dissection of it's so multi-layered with political dimensions and mental health dimensions and so on that we don't have all the information on yet. Um, Certainly, it seems to be an example of the danger of holding anger in, which is something that you write about.
Right, the challenge is being able to pause and reflect on the meaning of our anger,
Hmm.
and rather than react or feel overwhelmed by it.
Okay.
And by suppressing it or trying to ignore it, it eventually expresses itself in some form.
Uh-huh. Now, how did a nice guy like you get into studying anger and really building much of your career around anger? Uh,
My interests come from a variety of sources. Professionally, I was an elementary school teacher in the late 60s, early 70s in
okay.
South Bronx. And I learned to deal with my anger as well as helping the children deal with theirs. I also taught and worked on a psychiatric unit for many years and put together a variety of classes, one being anger management. And that's the professional track.
Uh-huh.
Personally, I had my own issues with anger. It wasn't like I got into many physical fights, but I would eventually voice and scream and yell. I corrected that by going to the end of the pendulum and kept it in until I would again scream and yell and have outbursts. But I think a bigger part of my interest has come from parents who themselves were very angry mostly at each other. And I saw a lot of bickering over the years. And in many ways, I would look at it as I developed anger about their anger. And I saw how that interfered with them living a more fulfilling life.
Yes, yes. So, one of the distinctions that you make is healthy versus unhealthy anger. So, tell us about that, how we can distinguish one from the other.
Sure, healthy anger, as I was mentioning earlier, is the ability to pause and reflect on our anger rather than react to it or feel overwhelmed by it, and using anger as a signal to turn our attention inward to identify what kinds of thoughts are contributing to my anger, what kind of expectations, what kind of feelings are behind the anger. I indicate that anger is a reaction to inner pain. And so I might feel shame or guilt, fear or anxiety. Those feelings push me into anger. Working backward, I see that healthy anger also involves looking at what's my key desire that I'm feeling is threatened.
Hmm.
Uh, a sense of trust, safety, connection with someone, respect, because anger is all about those desires feeling thwarted or challenged.
So, anger is clearly something that's natural to us, and not just to us, but probably to all animals, I guess. And so, what purpose does anger serve?
So it is a natural emotion, natural feeling, and the goal of anger management isn't to stifle or ignore it, but to rather understand it. It gives us a message. I've over the years come to view anger as an expression that starts out as an attempt at self-compassion. When we're angry, we
Wait a
distress.
second. I got to stop you there.
Sure.
You say anger starts out as an attempt at
Uh-huh.
self-compassion?
Right.
That feels like a leap. Give us the
Okay.
steps in between.
If we're in pain, we want to address that pain and get rid of it. And the internal pain, for some people, it's easier to be angry than to experience the tension in their bodies from shame, guilt,
Oh,
feeling powerless. So momentarily, when I'm angry, I focus my attention outward on the person or the situation. I may not even be aware of what my body is feeling, the feelings behind it. Many times I'll work with clients, and some could say I felt tension in my chest or hands. Others say, when they ask about their body reactions, they say, I don't know what I'm experiencing because anger distracts. So it starts out as an attempt at self compassion. And when it's destructive, I say that's compassion going awry.
okay. Okay.
And when it's constructive, it's expressed in a more, whether it's assertiveness or being able to sit and calm oneself and soothe oneself to understand the meaning, then we can look inward to say, what is it I'm really needing? What more constructive ways can I go about satisfying those desires?
I remember there was a period when it seemed like there was a lot of stuff going on around assertiveness training. I haven't heard as much about it in recent years. Maybe I'm just out of the loop. Um, but there's some kind of relationship there between anger and assertiveness training.
Assertiveness communication is definitely one component of healthy anger, being able to address my needs, share with the person how I'm impacted, and especially in a personal relationship, without necessarily devaluing, criticizing in a negative way, putting down the other person. It's both compassionate and self compassionate at the same time. It's not aggressive, it's not passive. And traditionally, the focus is on when you do blank with a specific behavior so the person doesn't feel like you're criticizing them completely as a person. When you do blank, I feel blank,
Hmm.
meaning I feel a negative. I emphasize sharing first the negative feeling behind your anger. So when you do that, I'm feeling this hurt, ignored. Sometimes when I'm ignored, I become angry. To let the person know that kind of chronology.
Okay. Okay. Um, I'm thinking back to the 60s and 70s where um, people were, clients would often be encouraged to scream, pound pillows, maybe if it's a couple, to have these combat bats that were essentially pillows on sticks called batakas.
Takas,
Yeah, I think we're both old enough to remember that period.
definitely.
What's your take on that at this point in time?
Uh, that's a momentary discharge of the physical tension. And for some people, over the years, they've come to look at that as rehearsal. And what I
Yeah.
mean by that is, years ago, therapists would tell parents, if you're angry at your child, go in the other room, picture their face on the pillow, and hit it. And that's rehearsal. And they're
And many people were resistant to do that. I mean,
right,
they had a an internal sense that that this maybe isn't a good idea. I know
right.
because I pushed people in that direction, and
Uh-huh.
as I look back on it now and aware of this rehearsal critique, I think the rehearsal critique makes a lot of sense.
Right. On the other hand, there are some individuals who are so uncomfortable with anger, they may need to be encouraged to just hit a little punching bag or something, just to
Uh
get
huh.
some more connection with their own body, actually.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I believe that as well.
Uh-huh.
So it requires judgment and
Exactly.
a certain amount of finesse as to how you're going to intervene with that kind of thing. Um, how does a person know if they've got an anger problem?
In many ways,
Are there people who have one and they don't know it?
often.
Yeah.
I see a lot of people who come in because their spouse, girlfriend, boyfriend referred them. Sometimes company refers them. I see a few people who are court referred.
I wondered about that. Yeah.
And then there are individuals who are on their own, recognize, I've been this way for a long time. I realize it's getting in the way of my relationship or my career. So they recognize it. But often there's one triggering event that is the last straw event that might provoke them to come in.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Feel free to throw in any case examples that come to mind, by the way.
Sure.
Changing the names or
Okay.
other identifying factors, of course. Um, let's see here. So certainly anger is uh, overdetermined in a sense. There are multiple uh, sources that lead to anger or to the capacity for anger. And so, in your book, you look at some things such as the social environment, the family environment, genetics, brain science, etc. So let's move through some of that material in terms of what do we know about, scientifically about anger.
Sure. Uh, Number of studies suggest there may be a gene or several genes that trigger dopamine related to potentially more aggressive or aggression. Um, those are in the beginning stages of looking at that contribution. And like any aspect of personality, there's suggestion that certainly environment interacts in such a way for some people it might help trigger that gene or may not trigger the gene. So genetically, there may be a predisposition. If you think of just temperament, uh, infants in the nursery, if you wave your hand across their above them, some infants kind of respond almost just slowly, watching your hand move by, and others become startled very easily, so they're more thin-skinned.
Yeah.
Certainly, depending on the caretaking they have, that capacity to become self-soothing is increasingly being looked at as how does a mother or caretaker interact with an infant or child to help them develop the self-regulating mechanisms in the brain. And studies are suggesting that that's a very powerful contribution. For example, children who are abused physically or emotionally, they're saying that fast forward that their amygdala area responsible for emotional regulation, one area, is smaller. And
Hmm.
so the interpersonal interactions, firstly, those first few years are extremely important to help a child become self-soothing, to deal with frustration tolerance. Um, Another component of anger that has been really researched has been the type of attachment a child has to a parent. They've characterized a secure attachment if parents, for the most part, are consistently available emotionally, physically, and I say for the most part. Then the child grows into an adult who experiences the world as available, caring, supportive. They are more trusting of themselves as well. I must be lovable if this is people in the world are responding to me in this very positive way. By contrast, some individuals may have a more insecure attachment where parents are erratically available, physically, emotionally. Fast forward, that child may become an adult who they're craving a relationship, craving closeness, anxiety that they are not with someone. And then when they're with someone, they may feel anxiety that they're going to lose that person to the degree that they're more anxious. Their threshold to feel threatened is lowered. And so they become more vulnerable to anger.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you the relationship between anxiety and anger, and I guess you've kind of said it there.
Anxiety, anything that impairs judgment. So anxiety makes us more quick to look for threats as well as experience them. Depression may make people lead to being irritable, pessimistic in thinking, and well, other factors that can impair judgment would be drinking, fatigue, lack of sleep,
Hmm.
a lot of stress regarding deadlines and pressures like that.
Yeah, yeah. So we've really got a, multifaceted, multifactorial thing with anger, where genetics plays a possible role, temperament plays a role, uh, uh, nurturing or lack of it plays a role. Um, what else am I leaving out here? The whole, the various brain centers and so on. Hormones are in there somewhere.
Definitely.
The neurochemicals. Um,
And, and,
what
and
about the role of learning? We haven't talked about learning, and for a long time, psychology was all about learning.
right, and we model. We model behaviors we observe. Sometimes we don't have to be the victim of anger to model it. We see it demonstrated by siblings, by parents. I've sometimes over the years suggested that a lot of psychology overemphasized the importance of parents, in a sense, not neglecting sometimes the siblings. So children will model anger, how they handle it, how they don't handle it, in that way. The other kind of learning that takes place at the brain level, that's the field of neuroscience has increasingly helped us better understand the influence of learning. The idea being that with the more we practice certain behaviors and practice ways of thinking, the greater and the stronger are the connections in our neuronal connections in the brain. And that just means that the greater and stronger they are, the more likely we will have those same thoughts and behaviors. And so increasingly, emphasis is being looked at the ability to train our brain. So for anger management, the more we pause, we're training the brain to pause, which helps us in turn pause and be able to sit with uncomfortable emotions.
Yeah, you were just talking about modeling, which brings back to mind early work by Bandura uh,
Right.
with observing kids in the nursery and so on. And and what are your own thoughts about the modeling that we see in media? It seems like movies are more and more violent, going to just unrealistic extremes, and TV shows that kids are exposed to. And it feels like we're saturated in a lot of visual and auditory stuff about violence.
Right. Over the years, I've seen studies emphasizing there are a lot of mixed findings, but in general, they suggest that a person or a child or an adolescent who already is prone to anger will definitely be more impacted by visual stimulation, like video games, like movies. And it puts the burden on their other experiences, in my mind, to counteract what they're seeing and to help distinguish. That's a make believe world. Uh, but increasingly, the exposure, I do think that has an impact in people acting out. Um, not to, it's hard not to get political, but in terms of, I saw an article indicating that parents are having to talk to their children about making aggressive comments towards someone like, we're going to build a wall around you, or when are your parents taking you out of here already? So anger is demonstrated in all arenas and is easily picked up by children. They do observe it.
Yeah, I think you and I grew up in a different time where the media wasn't nearly so explicitly violent as it is today. And so, and this is a little self justification for going and watching those movies as much as I do. And sometimes I'm really turned off. I'm getting to the place where it's just so oversaturated that I'm losing my appetite for stuff that I used to enjoy. But I think as adults, we came up in a time where it was easier to develop an ego, if you will, that and to have an ego structure that was somewhat more peaceable, I guess,
Uh,
and that children are at a particularly fragile place in their development where they don't have any kind of ego structure that helps them to very clearly distinguish inside from outside and acceptable from unacceptable and so on.
right, that distinction has become, I think, more thin, exactly as you're saying. And for a whole variety of reasons, I think reduced attachment, reduced time spent together,
Yeah.
uh, reduced I'm not sure if caretakers are actually sitting down to talk about that particular issue, to distinguish this is a video or to limit the dosage. I
You know,
even,
I went out to dinner last night with some friends, and I was kind of shocked, not totally shocked, but to see that there were about six adults around the table and one young girl of about, I would guess, 7 or 8, who, and the girl had a laptop set in front of her, earbuds in her ears, and was watching a movie. And so this little girl was getting no interaction from the adults, no modeling from the adults other
uh,
than ignore your kid. It was kind of shocking. As a psychologist, sometimes I really have to bite my tongue
uh-huh.
to keep from going up to people and saying, "Excuse me, I'm a psychologist. This is a bad
Right.
thing."
It's sometimes challenging.
Yeah. Have you considered?
And similarly, I've seen, I pass by the playground and I see men holding their cell phone while they're swinging their child with the other hand, pushing them on the swing.
Yeah.
One scene, I wish I had had my camera out about a year ago. A man was walking with a stroller with his twins. They each had some kind of electronic device, like a mini iPad, and he was looking at his cell phone while they're walking along.
Yeah.
And the right, they lost interaction, the lack of face-to-face time together. I've seen studies where, and not to be critical of millennials, but I've seen studies where they're saying at interviews they don't look in the person's face as much
Hmm.
as they used to.
Huh. Interesting. Interesting. Something that you talk about are triggers and hot buttons, so maybe we should touch on that.
Okay, we all have hot buttons, and I emphasize that some of our hot buttons are like a physical injury. If I sprain or tear my calf muscle, I'll recover and eventually overall it will feel okay, but every once in a while I might turn into a certain angle or carry something heavy, and I'll say, "Oh, that's my calf muscle acting up." We may have hot buttons with sensitivity to um, abandonment, sensitivity to feel injustice. I saw a professor a while back where he was close to retirement, and he had an episode in the office where he became angry. And he got up and the chair fell down. And the secretary accused him of throwing the chair at her,
Wow. Yeah.
had a letter in his file, and wanted to sue to get the letter out of the file. And he realized that it cost a lot of money. Example of a asking forward to retirement. He said, definitely, I'm looking forward. I said, well, if you do that, your next few years will be spent, all your energy can be negative energy, trying to get that letter out. And he got to realize that he was someone who always fought for injustice. And that was the key issue for him. And he was able to let that go. Both his wife, his lawyer, and family said, please do not sue.
Yeah.
And it would cost thousands of dollars plus a lot of aggravation. And he was able to make peace with that.
We're having a little problem with Skype. I want to let you know that there were places there where you cut out a little bit. I think it will be intelligible in the long run. But just to let you know, if we lose our Skype connection, we'll just re-
Okay,
reconnect. It does
sure.
happen sometimes. Um, and speaking of hot buttons and all, it makes me think of the marital relationship, being married a long time.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like in our relationship, and I imagine it's not just us, there are some sort of hot buttons that just are designed to, not consciously designed, but are predictably going to cause a flare up, just a huge flare up.
Right.
Yeah.
In my book, I emphasize that when we enter a relationship, we have two adults and we also have two emotional minds. And I look at the emotional mind as this timeless part of us that's like a sponge. It soaks up all kinds of emotional experiences. And the emotional brain says, oh, I'm in a relationship again. I know what this is like. And so very quickly may have a lot of expectations that the person had in previous relationships. Expectations without even inviting the other person to understand them, to articulate them. So two people come in with very different sets of expectations. Everything from how I experience love. Do I experience it in words and gifts, time together, favors? To, well, I think the dishwasher should really be loaded this way, and you're wrong.
Yeah.
So
Right.
we come in with a whole variety of expectations, and those become sometimes the hot buttons for different couples in terms of what they're expecting and then what they're receiving.
Okay. Okay. So we were talking about the brain, and of course, there's a lot of talk about neuroplasticity these days. So if anger is to some degree embedded in our neural pathways, how can we retrain our brain?
Well, too often, I have to admit, I'm asked for a soundbite in a 5-minute interview about how to do that.
Yeah.
And I have a problem because I see it here obviously as being so complex and that it really takes time to practice. So the more we practice certain behaviors, for example, if a person is in a moment becoming angry, breathe deeply, and I emphasize and exhale deeply. All too often people inhale, but they don't exhale deeply. So the next part, though, is to evoke physical calmness. And that involves practice and rehearsing body scans, body relaxation with a sensitivity to what am I feel, what are my muscles feeling like when I'm relaxed. The more the person relaxes and practices, that's where the retraining of the brain goes on. And I emphasize learning anger management is changing habits. It entails practice like an instrument. And while it sounds like a burden, it does take time to learn to practice relaxation, to learn to practice the pause, to learn to identify what are the feelings behind my anger. So the more we do that, again, we then build up greater and stronger connections in our brain for those behaviors, those abilities, those skills.
Well, although we haven't been using the term explicitly, mindfulness, it's clear that your approach has been uh, greatly influenced by mindfulness.
Increasingly so. Over the years, I've read about it. I've seen research. The research has expanded. This past May, I went to a workshop, and John Kabat-Zinn was there,
Hmm.
and he showed a graph indicating that in 2000, maybe there were 30 articles with mindfulness in the title, and in 2015, there were 675. Uh, and I feel, both from the research as well as my own experience, that mindfulness is a very powerful practice to gain some distance from the experiences we have internally, feelings, thoughts. It allows us to observe them without feeling overwhelmed by them. So I practice it not as much as I'd like to, but I encourage clients to practice it as another major strategy so that when they become mindful, one, they can more easily complete an anger log that I detail in my book, but also in the moment, they could be more able to recognize what is my feeling behind my anger? What is my expectation? Is it realistic, distorted? What is my appraisal of the event? What conclusion am I jumping to? And so mindfulness is a very powerful tool for that. I was kind of delighted at the same workshop when John Kabat-Zinn said have so much time pressure, and I know the demand on our time is strong. He suggested that we actually, when we wake up, we're still in bed, do it for 10 minutes while in bed before we get out of bed. And when I say I was delightful, it kind of gave me permission.
Yeah, yeah, right.
And it's a nice start to the day. And I am increasingly doing that, plus, as I'll mention soon, self-compassion meditation or compassion meditation to follow that up. And it really has a very positive impact. And clients vary. It is difficult at first, whether they use mindfulness or not. I very strongly encourage the informal mindfulness practice, if they're not doing it formally, that on a given day they might check in. What am I feeling at this moment? What for this past minute? What's going on in me? Where have my thoughts been? Physically, what am I experiencing in my body? And doing that a few times a day helps increase their mindfulness to their inner experience, their inner landscape. Again, that's another way of becoming more attuned, more connected with themselves.
Yeah, I want to stay with this, but for just a moment, though, um, I'm trying to remember. I know there have been a ton of books, probably going way, way back, about managing your anger. And so I'm wondering, what was the approach before mindfulness? Do you know? I couldn't quite figure out, what were the books, what were the central organizing ideas around
Right,
around that in the
right.
past?
Primarily, it's been cognitive behavioral to include relaxation exercises. So, identifying distorted reasoning like generalization.
Oh, yeah.
If you did that, you don't love me. Black and white thinking. You always do that. In fact, I talk about that in my book, that the kind of thinking that we are used to is going to influence our vulnerability to anger. So they use cognitive behavioral reasoning with ourselves in that way. Uh,
Well,
and,
there's a
and
lot of overlap then. It's not either or, but
right.
actually the ideas are not incompatible, are they?
No, they're very much integrated in very practical use. And I encourage some reasoning at the same time. I've always felt just reasoning neglects the emotional component.
Yeah.
And it could be if you're trying to reason with that part of yourself that is you're more childlike. I also say, well, that's kind of like trying to reason with a 4-year-old. Intellectually, they're just not ready. They are still feeling some kind of hurt, some kind of pain. And that's where I start to and have increasingly used skills and compassion. So it is an integrative model, but it draws on the older approaches as well.
Do you know if there's been research on mindfulness in relation to anger management specifically?
I saw some articles just last weekend, a few that are showing up the MBSR, uh, mindful based stress
Reduction.
reduction.
Yeah.
Right. I saw a program recently that was focusing specifically on anger, and it did show a decrease after participation in that program.
Okay. Okay. Because this is increasingly important in today's
Sure,
world.
definitely.
Yeah. Um, and let's see, what else do I want to ask you? Well, tell us more about compassion. And uh, you talk about both self compassion and compassion. And so, what's the order there?
Okay. For years, I emphasized to clients, like I say, I was didn't feel completely like cognitive behavioral, talking to yourself, reasoning with yourself was completely the answer. And so I suggest to clients that they reach into their most nurturing parental part, their kind part, their
Hmm.
compassionate part, to talk to. Sometimes I say to your emotional brain, to your child logic is a word I coined. Um, and so, lo and behold, increasingly I've seen studies about using compassion. And the compassion now has been researched with neuroscience, meaning they're finding that if I think compassionate thoughts about someone else, wish them well, wish them good health, uh, the part of my brain that gets activated is the same part of the brain that gets activated if I tell myself, may I have good health, may I be safe, may I be free of suffering. And so compassion for others and compassion for ourselves activates the same part of the brain, same area. And the studies on compassion, they're leaning toward identifying that when we engage in compassion meditation, we lower cortisol, the hormone responsible for fight, flight, and studies suggest that oxytocin increases, the love hormone, which if you hold hands with your loved one, oxytocin increases. The mother has an infant, and the oxytocin levels rise in her system to help bond with that infant. So doing compassionate meditations helps our body become calm and soothe the feelings that we're experiencing with. It enables us to sit and observe discomfort from that more compassionate self. And the exercises in compassion that I include in my book that have been researched, that we evoke a compassionate self. And again, that takes practice to be in touch with our compassionate self. And for most people, it's much easier to be compassionate with others. So it takes a lot of practice. But it's another component for dealing with anger and the feelings behind it.
Yeah, I interviewed Christine Neff some years back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, who really has been the pioneer in the area of self-compassion,
Right.
and kind of brought it uh, into a place where people who are scientifically oriented could talk about it without shame.
Exactly. Here's
Yeah,
scientific data, the base for it,
right.
and it has really extensive research.
Yeah. So, you've coined some terms that pop up in your book. One of them is prairie dog. Tell us about what you call the prairie dog syndrome.
Right. I've identified prairie dog syndrome, and I tell clients you'll never see it in the diagnostic manual, but it's
Right.
that sensitivity, being hypervigilant for threat, like that little prairie dog standing on its hind legs, hypervigilant for threat, but also very quick to experience a threat. And so I feel that some people are more prone to a prairie dog syndrome. Often individuals who may have had a very harsh, threatening environment growing up, highly intense, highly tense, may be subject to that kind of a syndrome, being the witness to drama, emotional, physical abuse. And so by labeling it, it helps people better understand that it's part of my backstory. It's not a character flaw.
Okay. An interesting question that you raise in the book is how we can help diffuse a furious partner. And
Okay.
please, please, what's the answer?
uh, so your partner's angry. I emphasize the first primary objective is to use all the strategies that you can to get yourself calm. Emotions are contagious. And if I get myself calm, I'm working from my reasoning brain to be able to, in a sense, govern and manage my emotions. So that's the first step. We call being physically calm for yourself. Then I emphasize it's easy to yell and scream across a room or across different rooms. So I suggest moving closer. And maybe not too close, but with an eye range, because it's harder to yell and scream and say all kinds of things to your partner in most cases if you're looking them in the eye. I suggest talking in a low voice and slowing down the pace of your speech. Again, feelings, emotions are contagious, and if you're lowering your voice, the goal is to help that person feel safer. Anger is about feeling some kind of a threat. And so helping that person feel safe is a primary goal. So lowering your voice. Uh, Also, helping the person recognize that you know they're angry. I can tell you're angry, so you're validating their anger. And then the next part you may want to suggest, I can't read your mind. Maybe you're hurt. Maybe you felt ignored. Could we talk about that? So you're validating the anger, but also addressing the real hurt behind it and your willingness to talk about that. Um, Another way is to uh, agree in part. If your partner has more general global thinking, you always do that. What can you say to agree in part to that? Well, I sometimes do that. All agreements, all negotiations are based on some common ground. And so agreeing in part is one way. Uh, Another way would be someone says, you're so stupid. An evaluation of you as a person and agreeing in part, you might respond, I sometimes do stupid things, bringing it back to specific behavior. I also recommend what I call freeze focus. Your partner or spouse is saying, you know, you did this last week, you did it last month, you're doing it again. And it might be helpful to say, one, try not to be critical that the person is bringing up past events, because if they are, remind yourself that means they just haven't let go of that they still have feelings about that they need to look at. So you may want to say, it's me, I can only handle one thing at a time. Could we please talk about what just happened now? And we'll come back at some other time to those other things.
Okay.
I also recommend at some point setting limits, saying, it's me, I maybe you want to talk about that, but I don't deserve the loud yelling, screaming, the abusive language. I need to take time out. I need to go relax. I emphasize going in another room rather than leaving the house. Leave the house and you create all kinds of abandonment issues, trust issues. So it really exacerbates dealing with the issue that prompted the anger in the first place.
Yeah, I think men are kind of prone to that, aren't they? More
Right,
prone to
right,
leave the house, slam the door.
exactly. And if they can't contain it and go in the other room, I offer in my book guidelines for engagement. And one of those includes that kind of setting limit. I really want to calm myself and go in the other room. If the person isn't respecting that, banging on the door, doing whatever he or she can to get in, then I say, well, I'm sorry, but I really need to leave the house now.
Do you work with
So
Do you work with couples at all?
not anymore. I used to work with couples. I see all individual adults at this point.
Okay. And what
In fact,
about, yeah,
for my for my classes, I tell people I will not work with a couple because the partner is distracting from the person looking in themselves, what is prompting their anger. So I work on a more individual basis.
okay. And what about working with court-appointed people who I'm imagining might come in initially resentful and uncooperative? Is that your experience or not?
It varies. I see court-appointed people often for a first offense, those involved in a first offense, or sometimes they come in as a way to look better in their court appearance. Those who are more chronic, those who are long-term domestic abuse or other expressions of anger, often the courts require 10, 20 sessions in a group format, and I don't offer that. On the individual basis, people will come in sometimes resentful, sometimes then emphasizing they don't need to be there. And yet in the sessions they attend, they very quickly identify some strategies that can be helpful. So the courts just see that as a resource.
Earlier, you mentioned something called an anger log, and I meant to pick up on that, and I forgot to. Tell us about the anger log and what that is and how you use it.
Sure. I have a framework of looking at anger, and what I do is invite a client to describe an event and try to recall an event during which they became angry. The people involved, the situation, the environment, what led up to it. And I suggest they imagine that on an imaginary video. But this video is a strange one. You can look inside yourself to see what kind of feelings you have as well, what your body is experiencing, what your thoughts are. So the log is based on that model. And so I'll have them first identify in few words the triggering event. She spent money on a large TV. The event was the anger on a 1 to 10 scale, 7. And then I have them work backward, rewind their video. So when you were angry, what negative feelings were you experiencing right before you became angry? That's a challenge. And sometimes a person might say, angry. I say, okay, rewind the video a little further. Anxious. Okay. Very often I share a feelings list, and then they can more readily say, oh, okay, I felt disappointed. On a small scale, I felt a little betrayed. I thought we were on the same page financially. I helped them with the log include appraisal. What conclusion did they make? What knee-jerk reaction did they have when they saw this large TV in the living room? Well, my finances. I felt threatened. She's not agreeing to what we agreed to with finances, not spending so much. And then the log goes further, identifying expectations. In the past, has she been this way? I should say he or she. Well, yeah, often. And so I say, you're holding on to an expectation too rigidly then. If you're expecting that your partner, your spouse, is always going to be on the same page, but you're saying the history suggests otherwise, you're holding on too rigidly. And that's going to increase your vulnerability to anger. You're not being realistic. A bunch of our anger is holding on without awareness too rigidly to expectations that either may not be realistic, or they may be so overly influenced by our emotions, they're really hopes and wishes rather than any attention to what the history is.
Okay, well, that anger log
And so it's a
sounds...
log that helps them work backwards. That
Yeah,
includes. It's very powerful to kind of take a magnifying glass to the internal experience that occurs in nanoseconds. And the more
right.
people complete that log, they not only understand the past event, but they become more mindful, more aware, more sensitive with future events as to what's going on internally.
Yeah, that anger log has a very behavioral kind of feel to it. But
Right.
I can see that it would be useful. I imagine people might slough off on their assignment a bit or have some resistance.
It, it, as you say, it has a behavioral component. It increases and expands their mindfulness to their internal experience. And some people don't make entries. I've had some people, after first introductions to the models, become very aware in the next week. I didn't realize how many expectations I have. I walk through the day saying this person should behave that way. That person should behave that way. I have a blueprint in my mind, and I didn't realize how rigidly I was holding on to that. And for some, that alone has made a very powerful difference in their capacity to reel in their expectations. And others do complete the model. But you're right, it varies on the individual.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as we wind down, I wonder if there's anything else that you'd like to add, maybe that we haven't touched on that's central to the way you work or the
I
model.
uh, I emphasize that, for one, the good news is people can change these habits.
Okay.
We all think of that this is part of our character, and I think I also help people identify there are challenges to letting go of anger. One is I'll feel vulnerable. I'll feel those feelings behind my anger, or anger in the short term might work. It gets people to do what you want, but that's the short term. In the longer term, your key values, your key desires are going to be less likely satisfied with anger. Anger may feel a physical rush. Some people experience as a physical rush in their body to be angry. And anger can be protective. And so if I let go of anger, I might feel responsible for my own life now instead of being angry at people in my past. And then I face the anxiety of, okay, how do I want to live? What choices do I want to make? And I'm free to do that.
Hmm.
So, but the key message is that anger is something that can be managed constructively, and it has deep meaning if we take time to look at it.
Okay, well, that's a good wrap up. So, Dr. Bernard Golden, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you for having me.